Bismillahi walhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillahi. Today we wanted to talk about the idea of learning da'wah through the experiences of converts. And we have an interesting story today about a Muslim brother who journeys to Islam. His name is Eddie. And Eddie goes through a set of experiences which ultimately lead him to find Islam. And his story is entitled Finding Inner Peace Through Islam. Eddie comes from the East Coast, from the New England area in Massachusetts, and one of the first encounters that he had, according to his story, with Islam was reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. And that was the beginning of his journey in which he began to question himself and question Christianity, which is the religion that he grew up with. He talks about how, as a Christian, he really didn't believe in the stories that were popular amongst Christians, in specific, that Jesus, peace be upon him, was born on the 25th of December, or even how it is that Jesus was God, or in the concept of the Trinity. And this is one of the reasons why we always emphasize that when we talk about people and what it is that they believe, and especially when we use terms like mushrik and kafir, that we are careful to properly understand these terms. Because a lot of times when we use the term mushrik, or a person who associates partners with God, or a person that commits idolatry, that is worshiping something along with God, we're not always sure, especially when we talk about people that associate with Christianity, that they are exactly doing that. And we're not always sure 100% that we can actually call them a kafir, in the sense that they totally have rejected belief in God, or in the sense that they have rejected the oneness of God, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't mean that those terms don't have their own value. But in da'wah, we have to be careful. Here, Eddie, first of all, is teaching us that he himself didn't believe that Jesus was God, although he was associating with Christianity. And so sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that a person, even though they may associate with Christianity, they believe in the Trinity. And then when we go deeper, we find that that's not the case. And there are a lot of people that exist like that. Now, they may not fully be considered to be a Muslim from the angle of having accepted the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as a prophet, but they definitely, in this case, can't be considered to be a mushrik, in the sense of someone who associates partners with God, if the person is actually telling you that they, in this case, that he didn't believe that Jesus is God, but does believe in some sort of concept of God, right? And so our position has to be one in which we are supportive, one in which we're not coming to box people in or judge them, but we're actually being supportive so that we can encourage their growth and development and not push people away from the deen. And that's very much what we find in the hadith, bashiru wa la tanaffaru, right? In the sense of give good tidings, encourage hope to people, and don't push them away from Islam, right? Facilitate for people, yassiru wa la tu'assiru. Make things easy, don't make things difficult. In da'wah, that's especially important because we're talking about something that is radical. We're talking about people changing their lives. And it's not easy for many of us to leave our habits. It's not easy for many of us to leave the way that we like to be. So then what about when we start asking someone to change lifestyle, to change the way they believe, to become a person from another religion. So that is a process in which people need to be supported and taken care of. And that's one of the reasons why when we focus on the issue of dawah, it's not a task that just anyone can engage, because we're dealing with people. And like Sheikh Khalid Amin said, dawah pretty much has a lot of elements that come back to social work, because you have to deal with people at different levels. But let's get back to the story of Eddie. So Eddie, he comes from a Dominican background, from the ancestry of those who live in the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean. And he talks about how he was a young child, and he had three younger brothers, and his parents were divorced when he was about 11 or 12 or so. And he talks about how his mom was a strong mother from the angle that she gave them a good upbringing. But as a youth, he found himself struggling as a youth of a divorced family with a single female headed household. Although his mother, she invested in the family, and although she worked to give him and his siblings a good upbringing, he found himself struggling with life on the street. So he talks about how by the time he hit 16 years old, he found himself struggling with street culture. And people, we learned a lot of lessons from this. Divorce in itself brings an insecurity to children. Divorce in itself opens our children to having emotional troubles, difficulties in learning, difficulties in adapting. And a lot of times it leaves within the hearts of our children a hole. And so they find themselves looking for acceptance. And this is one of the lessons that we can learn from this story of Eddie. And versus judging people that we find that are having social issues, or people, for instance, that go to the street, we can learn that in the streets, there may be people that have an actually good background, that they end up in the streets, not necessarily because they're bad people, but because they've had challenges, right? And so he began to engage in street life, right? And so then one of the things that he began to do was go to school, go to college, and at the same time live a street life. You see what I'm saying? And so you see the ambition of wanting to progress in life and wanting to do things in the right way, but at the same time being caught in that type of environment, and to the point where what he was doing didn't work for him, and he found himself arrested, but he was never convicted. It was like as though he was protected. He was given a chance and given warnings. He was in a situation where he was clashing with life, but there was enough room for him to be able to turn his life around, especially when we talk about the case of being involved in the streets. And so, we have to think about this from a couple of different angles. Dawah is not just dealing with those who don't have an understanding of Islam, but Dawah is also dealing with our children, dealing with our youth. Dawah is dealing with those who are struggling. And to be honest with you, for instance, here at the North Hudson Islamic Educational Center, we've even had non-Muslims come where they may have a Muslim relative, and we find ourselves having to support the non-Muslim because we want to support the Muslim relative. And so that was even, being in a position where it is that you can support those who may not be Muslim, right? But they believe in God and they entrust in you. And they may not even believe in God, but they entrust in you their secrets. They entrust in you their hurt. They entrust in you their struggles. And so as Muslims, what is it that we bring to the table, right? And so we, this part of the story tells us that sometimes life itself gives people the opportunity. And we basically are saying in brief, Allah gives people opportunities in life. And so if Allah is giving people opportunities in life to correct themselves, then we should assist in that process to facilitate good for people. And so he talks, interestingly enough, how he ended up changing his life around, but he was still struggling. And he got a good job. And at this job, he had co-workers that ended up dying during the tragedy of 9/11. And he talks about how some people had lost their jobs and how people had mental breakdowns. Then he began to dig deeper into the whole incident of 9/11, which affected him directly or indirectly and affected his co-workers directly. And he began to see that those who were being accused of the incident were Muslims with the Saudi Arabian background. So he said that he was worried about that, and he began to do research, right? And he was very concerned. And so he found himself researching Islam to try to figure out what it was that was going on. He didn't want to depend solely on the news, and so he decided to buy a Quran and see for himself what it is that are the teachings of Islam. And people, this is why it's extremely important that the information that we communicate with regard to Islam is information that's solid, is information that serves the da'wah, is information that has integrity, not information that is based on customs or cultures or historical circumstances which don't reflect the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's extremely important, because sometimes we have some understandings of the Quran, and sometimes we have some understandings of certain hadith, and those understandings are not understandings which we can consider to be really integral to Islam. They're understandings which have problems. And so if people are searching for Islam, and if they are looking to find out information, and the information that they have is not information that's solid, then the community is responsible for that issue from the angle of da'wah. Why? Because then we're not serving the whole purpose of educating people on Islam. But when I talk about the community, I'm talking about the whole of the Muslim community in the US. Because we can't afford to be in a situation where people are misunderstanding Islam because we didn't devote the time and the effort and the resources to be able to educate people solidly on Islam so that they can have trustable, reliable resources that give them information that has integrity to it. And that's the importance of da'wah when it comes to education. So he talks about how it was that he bought a Quran at Barnes and Nobles. And he began to be careful that others weren't not witnessing or seeing or realizing that he was studying about Islam. But one of his co-workers that was Muslim took note. And that co-worker, even under those circumstances, and we know what the time was like, decided to invite Eddie to the masjid. And that's something that is important, that the masjid be prepared in order to be able to deal with people that have questions, because Eddie didn't become Muslim right away. Eddie didn't become Muslim right away. And matter of fact, Eddie went to the mosque and then he retreated back. He didn't become Muslim right away. And some of us think that success is in the issue of a person taking Shahada on the spot. But Eddie was not convinced right away that he was ready to become Muslim. And I've had those encounters of people that come into our community here in Union City, and they come to the masjid and they ask about Islam, and then when we think that they're going to take Shahada, immediately they disappear. It doesn't mean that we are not successful in our outreach. It doesn't mean that we didn't touch the person. It could mean that they're not ready at the moment. Even many stories we can find of people that their journey to Islam is a long journey. And there's different encounters that they have with Islam throughout their lives, and those encounters, they vary. They're encounters that are distinct, and they all take place almost back to back before the person becomes Muslim, right? And so one of the things that Eddie highlights, is that his coworker that was Muslim had good character, very polite, very helpful, very concerned with others. And that's the best da'wah, people. The best da'wah is the actual character of the Muslim showing itself in everyday interaction with people. And trust me, that has an impact for the well-being of those that are around us and for the education of others into what Islam is, because educating people through speeches and books, videos, and so on and so forth is never going to replace the actual living example of a person interacting with others as a good Muslim, right? And so one of the things that Eddie talks about is that when he went into the masjid and he saw people praying, that he experienced inner peace. And he said the internal peace I felt that day was one I would come back to years later. It took him years to come into Islam. And he continued to read off and on, but he was too caught up, he said, to be actually a Muslim. And he said he had to stop smoking, drinking, and partying, and so on and so forth. And we have to remember this, that a lot of times the way that people understand Islam is that they understand the Muslim to be on such a high status. The Muslim is divorced from sin and errors and mistakes. And we have to realize that the Sahaba themselves, that's not the approach that they took to Islam. The Sahaba themselves struggled with different issues in their lives prior to becoming Muslim. And so at the end, with some time, Eddie became Muslim, and he took his Shahada, and he told us his story. And so we learn a lot of things from this example. One is that people are on a journey when they come into Islam. So we have to ask ourselves, how is it that we facilitate that journey for them? Two, our masajid have to be prepared for these types of people that are looking. They may not necessarily be in a situation that they may not be in a situation in which that they're ready to come into Islam. And so we have to support people where they're at. The other is that we, as Muslims, in our interactions with others on an everyday basis, have to realize that people look to us to understand what is Islam. So if our interaction with them is not one that is wholesome, they can distort the meanings of Islam. Another point that we can take is that we have to meet people where they're at, and people necessarily don't have to be perfect to take Shahada. They don't necessarily have to leave off everything that they're doing right away that contradicts Islam. They can take Shahada and work on their journey, and we have to emphasize this to people, right? That Islam is about bettering yourself. It's not about coming to Islam perfect. And of course, everyone is going to have their own journey. And at the end of the day, our environments have to be environments in which people find a sense of peace. So we ourselves, especially in our masjid environments, have to ensure that our masjid environments are not chaotic, that they're environments where people can renew themselves and refreshen themselves, that they're environments that are open for people to see what is the reality of Islam. And with that, we come to an end. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.